continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. We start today on Crassus. Marcus Crassus, whose father had borne the office of a censor and received the honors of a triumph, was educated in a little house together with his two brothers, who, married in their parents' lifetime, they kept but one table amongst them. All which, perhaps, was not the least reason of his own temperance and moderation in diet. One of his brothers dying, he married his widow, by whom he had his children. Neither was there in these respects any of the Romans who lived a more orderly life than he did, though later in life he was suspected to have been too familiar with one of the Vestal virgins, named Licenia, who was nevertheless acquitted upon an impeachment brought against her by one Plotinus. Licenia stood possessed of a beautiful property in the suburbs, which Crassus, desiring to purchase at a low price, for this reason was frequent in his attentions to her, which gave occasion to the scandal, and his avarice, so to say, serving to clear him of the crime, he was acquitted, nor did he leave the lady till he had got the estate. People were wont to say that many virtues of Crassus were darkened by the one vice of avarice, and indeed he seemed to have no other but that, for it, being the most predominant, obscured others to which he was inclined. The arguments in proof of his avarice were the vastness of his estate and the manner of raising it, for whereas at first he was not worth above 300 talents, yet, though in the course of political life he dedicated the tenth of all he had to Hercules, and feasted the people, and gave to every citizen corn enough, grain. They don't mean what we typically mean when we say corn. Enough to serve him 3 months. Upon casting up his accounts, before he went upon parting expedition, he found most of his possessions to amount to 7,100 talents, most of which, if we may scandal him with the truth, he got by fire and rapine, making his advantages to the public calamities. For when Sulla seized the city and exposed to sale the goods of those that he had caused to be slain, accounting them booty and spoils, and indeed calling them so too, and was desirous of making as many and as eminent men as he could partakers in the crime, Crassus never was the man that refused to accept or give money for them. Moreover, observing how extremely subject the city was to fire and falling down of houses by reason of their height and their standing so near together, he bought slaves that were builders and architects, and when he had collected these to a number of more than 500, he made it his practice to buy houses that were on fire, and those in the neighborhood, which, in the immediate danger and uncertainty, the proprietors were willing to part with for little or nothing, so that the greatest part of Rome, at one time or another, came into his hands. It's an interesting approach, but if it's a way to get land, right? Yet for all he had so many workmen, he never built anything but his own house, and used to say that those that were addicted to building would undo themselves soon enough without the help of other enemies. And though he had many silver mines and much valuable land and laborers to work in it, yet all this was nothing in comparison of his slaves. Such a number and variety did he possess of excellent readers, amanuenses, how are you supposed to say that? I'll remember in a minute here. Silversmiths, stewards, and table waiters, whose instruction he always attended to himself, superintending in persons while they learned, and teaching them himself, accounting it the main duty of a master to look over the servants that are indeed the living tools of housekeeping, and in this indeed he was in the right, and thinking that is, as he used to say, that servants ought to look after all other things, and the master after them, for economy, which in things inanimate is but money-making, when exercised over men becomes policy, but it was surely a mistaken judgment when he said no man was to be accounted rich that could not maintain an army at his own cost and charges. For war, Archidamus well observed, it is not fed at a fixed allowance, and so that there is no saying what wealth suffices for it, and certainly it was one very far removed from that of Marius. For when he had distributed 14 acres of land, a man, and understood that some desired more, God forbid, said he, that any Roman should think that too little which is enough to keep him alive and well. Crassus, however, was eager to be hospitable strangers. He kept open house, and to his friends he would lend money without interest, but called it in precisely at that time, so that his kindness was often thought worse than paying the interest would have been. His entertainments were, for the most part, plain and citizen-like. The company, general and popular. Good taste and kindness made them pleasanter than sumptuously would have done. As for learning, he chiefly cared for rhetoric, and what would be serviceable with large numbers. He became one of the best speakers at Rome, and by his pains and industry outdid the best natural orators, for there was no trial, how mean and contemptible soever, that he came to be unprepared. Nay, several times he undertook and concluded a cause where Pompey and Caesar and Cicero refused to stand up, thereupon which account particularly he got the love of the people, and who looked upon him as a diligent and careful man, ready to help and succor his fellow citizens. Besides, the people were pleased with his courteous and unpretending salutations and greetings, for he never met any citizen, however humble and low, but he returned him his salute by name. He was looked upon as a man well read in history, and pretty well versed in Aristotle's philosophy, in which one Alexander instructed him, a man whose intercourse with Crassus gave a sufficient proof of his good nature and gentle disposition, for it is hard to say whether he was poorer when he entered into his service, or while he continued in it, for being his only friend that used to accompany him when travelling, he used to receive from him a cloak for the journey, and when he came home had it demanded from him again. Poor, patient sufferer. He even, when even the philosophy he professed did not look upon poverty as a thing indifferent, but of this hereafter. Philosophy is not just quotes, but, you're looking at things through a perspective and, like the eternal recurrence thing. Well, if this life is it, would you do this? Would you believe this if this life was it? That sort of stuff. When Cinna and Marius got the power in their hands, it was soon perceived that they had not come back for any good they intended to their country, but to effect the ruin and utter destruction of the nobility. At as many as they could lay their hands on, they slew, amongst whom were Crassus's father and brother. He himself, being very young, for the moment escaped the danger, but understanding that he was every way beset and hunted after by the tyrants, taking with him 3 friends and 10 servants, with all possible speed he fled into Spain, having formerly been there and secured a great number of friends, while his father was praetor of that country. But finding all people in a consternation and trembling at the cruelty of Marius, as if it was already standing over them in person, he durst not discover himself to anybody, but hid himself in a large cave which was sent by the seashore and belonged to Vibius Pecianus, to whom he sent one of his servants to sound him, his provisions also beginning to fail. Vibius was well pleased at his escape, and inquiring the place of his abode and the number of his companions, he went not to him himself, but commanded his steward to provide every day a good meal's meat, and carry it and leave it near such a rock, and to return without taking any further notice, or being inquisitive, promising him his liberty if he did as he commanded, and he would kill him if he intermeddled. The cave is not far from the sea, a small and insignificant-looking opening in the cliffs conducts you in, and when you are entered, a wonderfully high road spreads above you, and large chambers open out, one beyond another, nor does it lack either water or light, for a very pleasant and wholesome spring runs at the foot of the cliffs, and natural chinks in the more advantageous place let in the light all day long, and the thickness of the rock makes the air within pure and clear, all the wet and moisture being carried off into the spring. While Crassus remained here, the steward brought them what was necessary, but never saw them, nor knew anything of the matter, though they within saw, and expected him at the customary times. Neither was their entertainment such as just to keep them alive, but given them in abundance, and for their enjoyment. For Pacianus resolved to treat him with all imaginable kindness, and considering that he was a young man, though it thought it well to gratify a little of his youthful inclinations, so far as just what is needful seems rather to come from necessity than from a hearty friendship, once taking with him 2 female servants, he showed them the place and bade them go in boldly, whom when Crassus and his friends saw, they were afraid of being betrayed, and demanded what they were and what they would have. They accordingly, as they were instructed, answered, they came to wait upon their master, who was hid in that cave. And so Crassus, perceiving it was a piece of pleasantry and of goodwill on the part of Vibius, took them in, and kept them there with him as long as he stayed, and employed them to give information to Vibius of what they wanted and how they were. Fenestella says he saw one of them, then very old, and often heard her speak of the time and repeat the story with pleasure. After Crassus had lain concealed there 8 months, on hearing that Cinna was dead, he appeared abroad, and a great number of people flocking to him, out of whom he selected a body of 2,500. He visited many cities, and as some right sacked Malacca, which he himself, however, always denied, and contradicted all who said so. Afterwards, getting together some ships, he passed into Africa, and joined Metellus, Pius, an eminent person that had raised a very considerable force. But upon some difference between him and Metellus, he stayed not long there, but went over to Sulla, by whom he was very much esteemed. When Sulla passed over into Italy, he was anxious to put all the young men that were with him in employment, and as he dispatched some one way and some another, Crassus, on its failing to his share to raise men among the Marsians, demanded a guard, being to pass through the enemy's country, upon which Sulla replied sharply, I give you for guard your father, your brother, your friends, and kindred, whose unjust and cruel mother I am now going to revenge. And Crassus, being nettled, went his way, broke boldly through the enemy, collected a considerable force, and in all Sulla's wars acted with great zeal and courage. And in these times and occasions, they say, began the emulation and rivalry for glory between him and Pompey. For though Pompey was the younger man, and had the disadvantage to be descended of a father that was disesteemed by the citizens, and hated as much as ever man was, yet in these actions he shone out, and was proved as so great that Sulla always used, when he came in, to stand up and uncover his head, an honor which he seldom showed to older men and his own equals, and always saluted him Imperator. This fired and stung Crassus, though indeed he could not with any fairness claim to be preferred, for he both wanted experience, and his 2 innate vices, sturdiness and avarice, tarnish all luster of his actions. For when he had taken Tudertia, a town of the Umbrians, he converted, as it was said, all the spoils to his own use, for which he was complained oft to Sulla. But in the last and greatest battle before Rome itself, when Sulla was worsted, some of the battalions giving ground, others being quite broken, Crassus got the victory on the right wing, which he commanded, and pursued the enemy till night, and then sent to Sulla to acquaint him with his success, and demand provision for his soldiers. In the time, however, of the prescriptions and sequestrations, he lost his repute again. by making great purchases for little or nothing, and asking for grants. Nay, they say he proscribed one of the Bretians without Sulla's order, only for his own profit, and that, on discovering this, Sulla never after trusted him in any public affairs. As no man was more cunning than Crassus to ensnare others by flattery, so no man lay more open to it, or swallowed it more greedily than himself. That's not quite what is actual in the whole shadow thing. The shadow is what, but it's not that you hate in others what you hate in yourself. That's not the shadow thing. The shadow thing is there's stuff that you don't know about yourself. Whatever it is, you don't know. Or your experience. And this particularly was observed of him, that though he was the most covetous man in the world, yet he habitually disliked and cried out against others who were so. It troubled him to see Pompey so successful in all his undertakings, that he had a triumph before he was capable to sit in the Senate, and that the people had surnamed him Magnus, or the Great. When somebody was saying Pompey the Great was coming, he smiled and asked him, how big is he? Despairing to equal him by feats and arms, he betook himself to civil life, where, by doing kindnesses, pleading, lending money, by speaking and canvassing among the people, for those who had objects to obtain from them, he gradually gained as great honor and power as Pompey had from his many famous expeditions. And it was a curious thing in their rivalry, that Pompey's name and interests in the city was greatest when he was absent, for his renown in war, but when present he was often less successful than Crassus, by reason of his superciliousness and haughty way of living, shunning crowds of people and appearing rarely in the forum, and assisting only some few, and that not readily, that his interest might be the stronger when he came to use it for himself. Whereas Crassus, being a friend always at hand, ready to be had and easy of access, and always with his hands full of other people's business, with his freedom and courtesy got the better of Pompey's formality, in point of dignity of person, eloquence of language, and attractiveness of countenance. They were pretty equally excellent, but however this emulation never transported Crassus so far as to make him bear enmity or any ill will, for though he was vexed to see Pompey and Caesar preferred to him, yet he never mingled any hostility or malice with his jealousy, though Caesar, when he was taken captive by the Corsairs in Asia, not the same thing as what we mean by the continent Asia, cried out, "O Crassus, how glad you will be at the news of my captivity." Afterwards they lived together and on friendly terms. When Caesar was going praetor into Spain, and his creditors, he being then in want of money, came upon him and seized his equipage, Crassus then stood by him and relieved him, and was his security for 830 talents. And in general, Rome, being divided into three great interests, those of Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus. As for Cato, his famous name was greater than his power, and he was rather admired than followed. Well, that's a better type of leader, right? Somebody that, well, I mean, actually, the following, but the people look up to the character and say, hey, this is something that can be, right? Rather than just somebody, just go along, he's part of the crowd, right? Well, someone to lead the crowd. The sober and quiet part were, for Pompey, the restless and hot-headed followed Caesar's ambition, but Crassus trimmed between them, making advantages of both, and changed sides continually, being neither a trusty friend nor an implacable enemy, and easily abandoned both his attachments and his animosities, as he found it for his advantage, so that in short spaces of time the same men and the same measures had him both as their supporter and as their opponent, He was much liked, but was much feared as much or even more. At any rate, when Sicinius, who was the greatest troubler of the magistrates and ministers of his time, was asked how it was he let Crassus alone. "Oh," said he carries hay on his horses," alluding to the custom of tying hay to the horns of the bull that used to butt, that people might keep out of the way. The insurrection of the gladiators and the devastation of Italy, commonly called the War of Spartacus, began upon this occasion. One Lentulus Batiates trained up a great many gladiators in Capua, most of them Gauls and Thracians, who, not for any fault by them committed, but simply through the cruelty of their master, were kept in confinement for this object of fighting one with another. 200 of these formed a plan to escape, but being discovered, those of them who became aware of it in time to anticipate their master, being 78, got out of a cook's shop, chopping knives and spits, and made their way through the city, and lighting by the way on several wagons that were carrying gladiators' arms to another city, they seized upon them and armed themselves, and seizing upon a defensible place, they chose 3 captains, of whom Spartacus was chief, a Thracian of one of the nomad tribes, and a man not only of the high spirit and valiant, but in understanding also, and in gentleness superior to his condition, and more of a Grecian than the people of his country usually are. And when he first came to be sold at Rome, they say a snake coiled itself upon his face as he lay asleep, and his wife, who was at this latter time also accompanied him in his flight, his countrywoman, a kind of prophetess, and one of those possessed with the bacchanal frenzy, declared that it was a sign portending great and formidable power to him, with no happy event. First, then, routing those who came out of Capua against them, and thus procuring a quantity of proper soldiers' arms, they gladly threw away their own as barbarous and dishonorable. Afterwards, Claudius, the praetor, took the command against them with a body of 3,000 men from Rome, and besieged them within a mountain accessible by one narrow and difficult passage, which Claudius kept guarded, encompassed on all other sides with steep and slippery precipices. Upon the top, however, grew a many wild vines, and cutting down as many of their boughs as they had need of, and twisted them into strong ladders, long enough to reach from thence to the bottom, by which, without any danger, they got down all but one, who stayed there to throw them down their arms, and after this succeeded in saving himself. The Romans were ignorant of all this, and therefore coming upon them in the rear, they assaulted them unawares and took their camp. Several also of the shepherds and herdsmen that were there, stout and nimble fellows, revolted over to them, and some of whom they gave complete arms, and made use of others as scouts and light-armed soldiers. Publius Varenus, the praetor, was now sent against them, whose lieutenant, Furius, with 2,000 men, they fought and routed. Then Cassinius was sent with considerable forces to give his assistance and advice, and him Spartacus missed but very little of capturing in person as he was bathing at Salina, for he with great difficulty made his escape, while Spartacus possessed himself of his baggage, and following the chase with a great slaughter, stormed his camp and took it, whereas Cassinius himself was slain after many successful skirmishes with the praetor himself, in one of which he took his lictors and his own horse. He began to be great and terrible, but wisely considering that he was not to expect to match the force of the empire, he marched his army towards the Alps, intending, when he had passed them, that every man should go to his own home, some to Thrac, some to Gaul, but they, grown confident in their numbers, and puffed up with their success, would give no obedience to him, but went about and ravaged Italy, so that now the Senate was not only moved at the indignity and baseness both of the enemy and of the insurrection, but looking upon it as a matter of alarm and dangerous consequence, sent out both the consuls to it as to a great and difficult enterprise. The consul Gellius, falling suddenly upon a party of Germans who, through contempt and confidence, had straggled from Spartacus, cut them all to pieces. But when Lentulus, with a large army, besieged Spartacus, he sallied out upon him, and joining battle, defeated his chief officers and captured all his baggage. As he made towards the Alps, Cassius, who was praetor of that part of Gaul that lies about the Po, met him with 10,000 men, but being overcome in the battle, he had much ado to escape himself with the loss of a great many of his men. When the Senate understood this, they were displeased at the consuls, and ordering them to meddle no further, they appointed Crassus general of the war, and a great many of the nobility went volunteers with him, partly out of friendship and partly to get honor. He stayed himself on the borders of Picenum, expecting Spartacus would come that way, and sent his lieutenant, Mummius, with 2 legions, to wheel about and observe the enemy's motions, but upon no account to engage or skirmish. But he, upon the first opportunity, joined battle, and was routed, having a great many of his men slain, and a great many only saving their lives with the loss of their arms. I presume that doesn't, that means their weapons, right? Well, because you have to throw the spears and all that stuff. Crassus rebuked Mummius severely, and arming the soldiers again, spoke too soon, right? He made, because I was raised LDS, and there's that story of the guy who chops off people's arms and goes put them back, which is a bit less crude than the Bible one. Those 200, he made them find sureties for their arms, that they would part with them no more, and 500 that were the beginners of the flight he divided into 50 tens, and one of each was to die by lot, this reviving the ancient Roman punishment of decimation, where ignominy is added the penalty of death, with a variety of appalling and terrible circumstances presented before the eyes of the whole army assembled as spectators. When he had thus reclaimed his men, he led them against the enemy, but Spartacus retreated through Lucania toward the sea, and in the straits, a meeting with some Cilician pirate ships, he had thoughts of attempting Sicula, where, by landing 2,000 men, he hoped to new kindle the war of the slaves, which was but lately extinguished, and seemed to need but little fuel to set it burning again. But after the pirates had struck a bargain with him, received his earnest, they deceived him and sailed away. He thereupon retired again from the sea and established his army in the peninsula of Rhegium. There Crassus came upon him, and considering the nature of the place, which of itself suggested the undertaking, he set to work to build a wall across the isthmus, thus keeping his soldiers at once from idleness and his foes from forage. This great and difficult work he perfected in a space of time short beyond all expectation, making a ditch from one sea to the other over the neck of land 300 furlongs long, 15 feet broad, and as much in depth, and above it built a wonderfully high and strong wall, all of which Spartacus at first slighted and despised. But when provisions began to fail, and on his proposing to pass further, he found he was walled in, and no more was to be had in the peninsula. Taking the opportunity of a snowy, stormy night, he filled up part of the ditch with earth and boughs of trees, and so passed the third part of his army over. Crassus was afraid lest he should march directly to Rome, but was soon eased of that fear when he saw many of his men break out in the mutiny and quit him, and encamp by themselves upon the Lucanian lake. This lake, they say, changes at intervals of time, and is sometimes sweet and sometimes so salt that it cannot be drunk. Crassus, falling upon these, beat them from the lake, but he could not pursue the slaughter because of Spartacus suddenly coming up and checking the flight. Now he began to repent that he had previously written to the Senate to call Lucullus out of Thrace and Pompey out of Spain, so that he did all he could to finish the war before they came, knowing that the honor of the action would redound to him that came to his assistance, resolving therefore first to set upon those that had mutinied and encamped apart, whom Caius, Canaicus, and Castus commanded. He sent 6,000 men before to secure a little eminence and to do it as privately as possible, which that they might do, they covered their helmets, but being discovered by 2 women that were sacrificing for the enemy, they had been in great hazard, and not Crassus immediately appeared, and engaged in battle, which proved a most bloody one. Of 12,300 whom he killed, 2 only were found wounded in their backs, the rest having died standing in their ranks and fighting bravely. Spartacus, after this discomfiture, retired to the mountains of Petelia, but Quintius, one of Crassus's officers, and Scrotha, the quaestor, pursued and overtook him, but when Spartacus rallied and faced them, they were utterly routed and fled, and had much ado to carry off their quaestor who was wounded. This success, however, ruined Spartacus, because it encouraged the slaves, who now disdained any longer to avoid fighting or to obey their officers, but as they were upon the march, they came to them with their swords in their hands, and compelled them to lead them back again through Lucania against the Romans, the very thing which Crassus was eager for news was already brought that Pompey was at hand, and people began to talk openly that the honor of this war was reserved to him who would come and at once oblige the enemy to fight and put an end to the war. Crassus, therefore, eager to fight a decisive battle, encamped very near the enemy and began to make lines of circumvallation. But the slaves made a sally and attacked the pioneers. As fresh supplies came in on either side, Spartacus, seeing there was no avoiding it, set all his army in array. And when his horse was brought him, he drew out his sword and killed him, saying, if he got the day, he should have a great many better horses of the enemies, and if he lost it, he should have no need of this. And so, making directly towards Crassus himself, through the midst of arms and wounds, he missed him, and slew 2 centurions that fell upon him together. At last, being deserted by those that were about him, he himself stood his ground, and surrounded by the enemy, bravely defending himself, was cut in pieces. But through Crassus had good fortune, and not only did the part of a good general, but gallantly exposed his person. Yet Pompey had much of the credit of the action, for he met with many of the fugitives and slew them, and wrote to the Senate that Crassus indeed had vanquished the slaves in a pitched battle, but that he would put an end to the war. Pompey was honored with a magnificent triumph for his conquest over Sertorius in Spain, while Crassus could not himself so much as desire a triumph in its full form, and indeed it was thought to look but meanly in him to accept of the lesser honor called the ovation for a servile war, and perform a procession on foot. The difference between this and the other, and the origin of the name, are explained in the life of Marcellus. And Pompey being immediately invited to the consulship, Crassus, who had hoped to be joined with him, did not scruple to request his assistance. Pompey most readily seized the opportunity, as he desired by all means to lay some obligation upon Crassus, and zealously prompted his interest. And at last he declared in one of his speeches to the people that he should be not less beholden to them for his colleague than for the honor of his own appointment. but at once entered upon the employment. This amity continued not long, but differing almost in everything, disagreeing, quarreling, and contending, they spent the time of their consulship without effecting any measure of consequence, except that Crassus made a great sacrifice to Hercules, and feasted the people at 10,000 tables, which measured them out corn for 3 months. Well, that's what you're supposed to do with spoils of war, right? When their command was now ready to expire, and they were, as it happened, addressing the people, a Roman knight, one Anatius Aurelius, an ordinary private person living in the